So guys, we're going to continue with chapter 5, and now what we're going to do, we're going to talk about components of GDP. So just think about, we already know that GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within the economy in a certain period of time. And remember, GDP kind of measures everybody's income in the economy or everybody's expenditure in the economy, isn't it? So GDP is this, like, just think about, it's like this huge pie that we have. Okay, and there are a lot of transactions that actually happen within this pie. So what economies do, they actually take this pie and divide by different kind of components. In order to understand better what is going on in the economy, they take this value of GDP divided on a kind of certain categories, and then it's easier for economists to analyze what is going on in the economy. So what are the components of GDP? So GDP is going to be denoted with letter Y, okay? A lot of times in economics, you know why this is output and this is going to be our GDP. So you know this till the rest of the semester, until the rest of your life. And our GDP is going to consist of consumption. I stands for investment, government purchases, and net exports. And we're going to learn that net exports are actually equals exports minus imports. That's going to be the formula. And what are we going to do? We're going to take each component separately, and we're going to discuss what do we include or not include in that component. So GDP, we divided this huge number, and we divided this into separate kind of categories, and we're going to talk about which or what each category actually includes. So the very first one is consumption. So the key word here is going to be total spending by households on goods and services in the economy. So once again, consumption is only what households, families spends on goods and services, not government, not corporations, but only our households. So when we talk about households where they consume, we need kind of to know this difference. When for example you as a household going to spend money on rent. Okay, so you rent in an apartment. Each month when you pay in rent for your apartment, that's going to be consumption component of GDP. So GDP is going to increase by the value that you pay to your landlord. Let's suppose it's $300. It's going to be in this consumption component, and GDP is going to increase by $300. Okay, so for those who are actually homeowners, and let's suppose they are not renting a car, but they're paying mortgage for their house. Not the actual mortgage is going to be included in GDP, but the rental value of that house. So once again, each neighborhood, each city, each district is going to have a different kind of rental value of their house. So therefore, if you pay a mortgage, then not the mortgage payment itself, but the rental value of your house is going to be included in GDP. Okay, so guys, if you're purchasing a newly constructed house, let's suppose, here you go, you're paying cash for it. Okay, you purchase a home and you paid cash for it, and you're a household. Then when you purchase this house that was new, it's not going to be the part of the consumption component of GDP. It's going to be part of the investment component of GDP. Once again, why it is so? Because house, it's something that you're going to use for a long time. It's such a durable good. Okay, it's part of some kind of big structure. So therefore, if household purchasing a house, it's not going to be the part of the consumption component of GDP. It's going to be part of the investment component of GDP. So the next one is going to be investment component of GDP. When we're talking about investment, we're talking about spending on some kind of capital equipment, structures, facilities. And usually, so if we talk about investment, it's going to be spending by businesses on some kind of big capital equipment. If, for example, business going to purchase a new building, if business is going to purchase a new equipment, for example, intellectual property, it's going to be the part of the GDP, but once again, remember, it's going to be the part of the investment component of GDP. Once again, guys, remember that it have to be legal transaction, it have to be this equipment, if you're buying it, have to be produced, this year, it have to be, that final good. So that's going to be the part of the, GDP. Remember, we talk about the inventory accumulation when, for example, Toyota Corporation produced a car December the 31st in year 2019. Most likely, they're not going to sell this car, but we need to calculate this in year 2019 GDP, isn't it? This is where the company put it as a part of their inventory, and therefore investment component of year 2019 is going to be affected by this transaction. So, and remember, the GDP for 2019 is going to increase by the value of the car. Okay, so therefore, once again, investments, this is spending by businesses on some kind of structures, facilities, equipment. Once again, intellectual properties. Remember, not the flour that baker is purchasing to make a pie, but if baker is purchasing if the baker purchasing a stove in order to, or oven in order to use to produce a pie, that's going to be our business capital. That's the part of the GDP. When the baker is purchasing flour, sugar, and apples, that's not the part of the GDP. Okay, one note over here that we need clearly know for the exam. When we're talking about investments from the point of view of purchasing stocks and bonds or some kind of financial obligations, that's not going to be the part of the GDP. Okay, it's not included in the investments, and it's not included in, in GDP. We're going to learn in the later chapters that, that's going to be contributing to the national savings account. But just think about, if you are as an individual, if you purchase stocks in Toyota Corporation, you're going to tell your friends, I invested in Toyota Corporation, isn't it? Because you purchase stocks. This is what we say, or this is what we use in the everyday language. But when you purchase stocks, you did not contribute to GDP. When the company is going to take your money and purchase that physical capital, purchase that equipment, or expand, then that's going to be the part of the GDP. When you purchase in stocks, nothing is happening in the economy. There is no transactions that is going to be recorded that is going to contribute to GDP. So therefore, stocks and bonds purchases and sale is not going to be the part of the GDP. The next one is going to be government purchases. So everything that government purchase is going to be the part of the GDP, and it's going to be the part of the government component of GDP. So just think about, if the city, and guys, we're talking about on the state of the federal, state, and local governments, okay? So if the city of Greenville, it's a local government, let's suppose they decided to build a bridge somewhere, okay? And they're hiring a, some kind of private company to do that. Whatever city of Greenville has actually spent, that's going to be the part of the GDP, and it's going to be the government component of GDP. Okay, if the state of North Carolina, for example, purchase, I don't know, some kind of building used for the government purposes, and let's suppose once again this building was, built this year, that's going to contribute to GDP. It's going to be the part of the government purchases component of GDP. Yes, GDP is going to increase by that amount. Or if the federal government, let's suppose the federal government purchased, for example, a new plane or military equipment, a new helicopter, okay, that transaction, whatever government spent, is going to increase our GDP. And once again, government component of GDP is going to increase, okay? One thing that we need to know over here, transfer payments, are not going to be the part of the GDP. And transfer payments, this is transactions that government actually, make, or this is the money that government give to people, but doesn't get any value in return. Okay, so once again, transfer payment, this is when government making a transfer payment to its citizens, but government doesn't get anything in return from that. then this is not going to be the part of the GDP. Okay, so for example, me, Miss Bowen, okay, I'm working for the government, isn't it? Because I'm teaching at ECU, I'm working for the government. When ECU is paying me money, or paying me my wages, is this going to be the part of the GDP? And the answer is yes, because I'm producing value in return. I'm producing the service of education to citizens. So when they pay me salary, that's going to be the part of the GDP. But when government is actually paying social security to an older person, or unemployment benefits to those people who actually lost their jobs, or if we're talking about social services, or social welfare income, that's not going to be the part of the GDP. Once again, government spend money on that transaction happen in the economy, but is this the part of GDP? No, because that retired person or that unemployed person or the person who actually received that welfare money, they don't produce any value in return for the government. So therefore, transfer payments are not going to be the part of the GDP. Next one is net exports. So net exports are equals exports minus imports. So guys, this is very important to understand. Remember, we talk about all goods that produce outside of the United States are not going to be the part of the GDP, because they are not produced on the territory of our country. If you're going to you're sitting probably at your home, or you're sitting, I don't know, somewhere in the library, just look around and see. Can you find me a good that produced in the United States? It's probably going to be hard to do, isn't it? Here you go. I have over here, I have my folders, I have a keyboard, I have a computer, I have my calculator. I purchased that, but if this was not produced in the United States, we cannot calculate this as the part of the US GDP. So therefore, what is going to happen? Okay, what is going to happen? All those goods that we're purchasing that were produced outside of the country, they're going to be the part of this import. And therefore, once again, initially, if I am Miss Bowen, if I'm going to purchase, for example, computer that was produced in China for my personal use, initially consumption is going to increase by the value of that computer. But then over here, since net exports equal exports minus imports, the value of this computer is going to be subtracted, and therefore GDP is not affected. So let's suppose I purchase a computer and I spent $500 on this computer. I'm a household, I purchased a computer, so therefore initially consumption is increasing by $500, but since this computer was produced in China, okay, this is imported good. Here it's going to be subtracted, this $500, and therefore GDP is actually going to be not affected. Okay, so this is what you need to understand. If the government purchasing a computer for their needs, whatever, to use somewhere at the courthouse, so let's suppose that computer once again was produced in China. Okay, they spent $500, government purchased that computer, so therefore government component is increasing by $500, but because this computer was produced in China, okay, it's imported good, this $500 is going to be subtracted here, and therefore once again GDP is not going to be affected. Initially this component is affected, but then it's subtracted over here, and GDP overall is not actually going to be affected. Okay, so therefore, yes, adding all these components together, once again you need to remember this till the rest of the semester, that GDP is actually equal consumption plus investment plus government spending and plus net exports. So guys, and remember, you need to know GDP for year 2019 for your country, definitely. So once again, I'll try to make a separate video on that, but for year 2019 GDP per person was higher than that. It was close to $65,000 per person, and GDP for the country, once again, different sources are going to tell you different information. Let's suppose we're going to say $22 billion. It was like 21.4. Okay, let's suppose we're going to say $22 billion. Couple of more things in here. Okay, let's do this learning activity really quick all together. So in this learning activity, we need to read the statement, and we need to kind of see what happened with GDP by by these different people doing these different transactions in our economy. So the very first one, and we need to tell which component of GDP is going to be affected. So Debbie spends $300 to buy her husband dinner at fine restaurant in Boston. Okay. Our question is, which component is going to be affected, if it's going to be affected, and what is going to happen with GDP? So once again, Y equal consumption plus investment plus government spending and plus an X. And remember, this one is exports minus imports. So is this legal transaction? Yes. Does it have market value? Yes. Who purchased the product? Debbie. She's a household, isn't it? Did it happen this year? Yes. As I understand, it happened, whatever, let's suppose today. Is this going to be the part of the GDP? Yes, it happened on the territory of the United States. Which component is going to be affected? Consumption, isn't it? Because Debbie is a household, so consumption is increasing by $300, and therefore our GDP is going to increase by $300. Okay, that's the answer for A. Let's suppose next one. So Sarah spends $1,200 on a new laptop to use in her publishing business. The laptop was built in China. Okay. So the first thing was a kind of, what is a kind of alerting you here? That it was built in China, isn't it? If it is built in China, it's not the part of the GDP. How are we going to record this transaction? Sarah spent $1,200 on a new laptop computer to use in her publishing business. So she's purchasing, this is going to be her capital equipment, isn't it? This is investment in her business. So therefore, initially our, investment component of GDP is going to increase by $1,200, isn't it? Then remember, since it was built in China, in here in imports, these $1,200 are actually going to be subtracted, isn't it? And therefore, overall GDP is not going to be affected. So guys, when you take in your test, when you take in your quiz, just see how the question is asking you. If they asking you which component of GDP initially affected and how did this transaction influence GDP, then you need to break it down into this. Investment is increasing, net export is decreasing, GDP is unaffected. Sometimes they can just ask, here you go, Sarah purchased computer that was produced in China. What happened with GDP? You know it was produced in China, GDP is unaffected. So you don't need to analyze all these components. So therefore, pay attention on the exam what the question is asking or how the question is asking. Okay. Next one, let's see if I can clean this up a little bit. Okay, so we have Jane, and Jane spends, okay, so Jane spends $800 on computer to use in her editing business. She got last year model on sale for a great price from a local manufacturer. So it's a last year model. This is a kind of our, couple of words that we need to pay attention, because GDP is only production that is currently produced. It was produced last year. Did she use, it doesn't say if it's new or used, but we assume she bought it maybe, let's suppose, new. Even if she bought it new, but it was a last year model, it means it was produced last year. So the company, since they didn't sell it last year, they would put it in their inventory, and we calculate this $800 as the GDP of this previous year. Okay, so therefore this year GDP, nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to be even recorded or affected over here. Nothing initially is going to increase and stuff like that. That's it. GDP just not affected because it was last year model. Okay, the very last one. This is probably a little bit more complicated that we need to pay attention to. So here you go. General Motors builds $500 million worth of cars, but consumers only purchased $470 million worth of cars. So how is this all going to be affected or recorded? Remember, we need to see which component is affected and how is this overall influence our GDP. So since they built $500 worth of cars, it seems to me that GDP have to be affected by this amount, isn't it? Consumers purchase only $470 million worth of cars. Which component is going to be affected? Of course, consumption, isn't it? Because they didn't say government purchase and they didn't say that businesses purchase, for their as their capital equipment. So consumption is going to increase by $470 million. Okay, so consumption is increasing by this amount. I'm sorry, this is, let's do this, $470 million. Where's the other 30 million go? What happened with that? So remember, if company did not sell goods that they produced that year, what is the company going to do? They're going to put it as a part of their inventory, isn't it? So therefore their inventory is going to increase by the remainder of $30 million, and therefore what happens with our GDP? Our GDP is increasing by the amount of $500 million. So guys, this is the components of GDP. You all awesome. You're all awesome. You rock. You can crush it. And I hope you know a little bit more about GDP after this video.